Hi, everyone, and welcome to our video presentation on the Constitution. As you can see by our Unit 2 topic, in this unit, we're going to talk about the organization of our government. Remember, at the beginning of the semester, we're going to spend this time talking about how our government is organized and where the source of law of our government comes from. So that way, as we move through the rest of the semester, as we talk about different types of laws like torts and contracts and property law, we'll have some context for how these laws were developed and where they come from. So really the foundation for all of our laws is to talk about the Constitution itself that gives us this framework for how our government is organized. So I'm just going to do a short overview in this presentation about the branches of government that are established in the Constitution, because then in our next unit, in Unit 3, we're going to dive even deeper into this discussion and get into a lot more about how the legislative branch makes law and how the judicial branch interprets the law. But for now, we're just going to focus on the framework of the government. So the Constitution was established, and many countries and all states also have their own constitutions, and it's really just a fancy way of saying how our government is going to operate. How are we as the people going to decide how to govern ourselves? So we in the United States have both a constitution that we call the U.S. Constitution, and that governs all of us on a national level. Remember, last unit we introduced the term federal to mean national. So we also can introduce the phrase U.S. to also mean federal and national. So when we're talking about the U.S. Constitution, we're talking about the federal government, and of course, each state has its own constitution. In the unit for this, in the unit here, I have given you a link to both the U.S. Constitution and to the Massachusetts Constitution. Obviously, not holding you responsible for memorizing the constitutions, but it's worth it to take a look to see how they are organized. So in addition to the framework for the government, constitutions also guarantee their citizens and residents certain individual rights, protections, and liberties. In the U.S. Constitution, we call the original 10 amendments to the Constitution the Bill of Rights. And those contain a number of the rights that we hold dear to us, like our freedom of speech, our right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. We will talk about some of those rights that are in the Bill of Rights in subsequent units. In fact, in Unit 5, we will talk about some of the individual liberties contained in the Constitution. And then at the end of the semester, when we do criminal procedure work, we will talk about the rights of the accused contained in the Bill of Rights as well. So as I just mentioned, the U.S. Constitution provides the framework for the federal government and established a couple of really important principles. And here's the two that I want you to know. Remember when the country was founded by the Founding Fathers. Remember we talked last unit about how the Founding Fathers were trying to move away from the controlling government of the monarchy of the king in England. And so that meant there were two really important themes on the mind of the Founding Fathers. One of them is the second one I have mentioned here, which is a balance of power. The Founding Fathers did not want to see all the power contained in one king. So they established in the Constitution 3 branches of government. I'll go through them in more detail in just a minute. But this way, not just one group of individuals hold all the lawmaking power. And so the idea is that we established 3 branches of government. Each has a certain role and responsibility, and each one has a little bit of control over the other so that no one branch can yield and control all the power. And that's what we call the checks and balances system. So that was one theme really important to the Founding Fathers. The other theme is something else we've already alluded to, which is the concept of federalism, that we had these 13 colonies that were now going to become part of one unified nation. And so the U.S. Constitution said, here's our framework for a national government, but we need to reserve some powers to the states as well. And so we see embedded into the federal U.S. Constitution a role for the federal government and what the national government is going to be responsible for. But we also have some powers reserved to the states. And that's the concept of federalism. So notice that the two big themes in the US Constitution both have to do with who holds the power to govern and how we have a check on that power. We see that with both the balance of the federal and state governments, and we see it with the three branches of government. There's more about federalism in our next PowerPoint in this unit. For now, I think that many of you are already aware of our three branches of government, but I do want to mention them again here. And again, keeping in mind in this class on Introduction to Law, if you could have your Introduction to Law hat on, we will talk all semester about different laws, and it's really nice to know where those laws come from. And we need to understand the balance of power among the three branches of government to get to that point. So the first branch of government is the executive branch. The second is the legislative branch, and the third is the judicial branch. And remember, because we have both federal government and state government, that these three branches exist at the federal level, but all the states also have these three branches of government. So when we talk about the executive branch of the federal government, we are talking about the President of the United States. But when we talk about the executive branch of the state government, who are we talking about then? If you said governor, you are right. Every state has a governor, and the governor is the head of executive branch at the state level. And although I won't go back to the other slide, the states also each have their own legislative branch and judicial branch. We'll get to more on that later. So the executive branch is the president and, of course, the vice president. The executive branch is charged with the responsibility to execute and enforce the laws. Notice I didn't write on here that the executive branch is responsible for drafting the laws. Who's that responsibility belong to? If you said legislative branch, you were right about that. We'll get to that in a minute. The legislative branch drafts the laws, but it's up to the President of the United States to enforce and execute those laws and make those laws happen. The President has helpers. We call that the President's cabinet. We also refer to these individuals now as being part of administrative law. And we'll talk about administrative law a little bit too, but in the President's cabinet, we're talking about the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, and other executive branches that help the President do his or her job. There'll be a her one day, not at the time of this recording, unfortunately. So that's the executive branch. The executive branch is balanced out, of course, by the legislative and the judicial branch. The legislative branch is that branch that makes legislation. This is the branch that drafts the laws. Again, in Unit 3, we will go through a lot more detail about how the legislative branch does its job. But one of the most important features in the US Constitution that harkens back to that theme of not having one individual like a king having too much control is the idea that we in the United States are a representative government, and we are represented in the legislative branch. We as US citizens vote every 4 or 6 years or 2 years, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next unit, to elect people to represent us at the federal government. We elect members of the House of Representatives, and we elect senators. And individuals from every state elect these individuals, citizens of each state elect these individuals to draft our laws. And we call those laws statutes. Notice the word is statutes with an extra T in it, not statues that stand nice and tall like this, like the Statue of Liberty. That's the legislative branch. So the legislative branch drafts the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. But where does that leave the judicial branch? Remember we talked in Unit 1 about common law and how important it is in our system of law that we put a lot of weight in what the courts say our laws do? Well, that's the judicial branch. The judicial branch, and of course, if we're talking about federal, we're talking about the federal court system. Their job is to interpret the laws that the legislative branch drafts. Because despite all the best efforts of our senators and representatives, there's often some ambiguity in those laws. There's something possibly conflicting, or when the law goes to apply to a regular person, we don't know what it means. And it's up to the courts to interpret those laws and to tell us what those laws mean. Of course, in doing so, the court system also resolves disputes between individuals, people, or companies. So where does that leave the states? Well, the Constitution also has a role for the state governments. And again, I'll mention that a little bit more in our PowerPoint on federalism. But states, of course, have their own government. So that's, again, the interesting system we have in the United States, where we have a national federal government, but then every state also has its own state government. All states, as we mentioned, have an executive branch that is the governor. All states have a legislative branch that makes the laws for that state. And we, of course, have legislative officials in the State House in Boston that we elect to represent us at the state level. And all states have state courts as well. As you drive your car around the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or any other state and you see a building that says courthouse on it, take a look to see if it is a federal court or a state court. If it's a federal court in Massachusetts, you must be in downtown Boston. All the others are state courts. So I'll end this video here, but make sure you listen to the other video in this unit a little bit more on federalism. And then I look forward to seeing you guys in Unit 3 next week, where we'll delve even deeper into how the legislative branch makes laws and how the judicial branch interprets those laws.